With the death of Rudolph I, Republican rebellions erupted in every quarter. It was believed that with the loss of Rudolph's leadership and fierce personality, the empire would soon crumble. However, that kind of thinking was too optimistic. The aristocrats, military leaders, and bureaucrats that Rudolph had been nourishing at his side for the past 40 years made up a troika far stronger than the Republicans' hopeful estimation. These forces were led by Lord Horchim of Neustaufен, who was both the emperor's father and prime minister. Displaying the composed, cool leadership that might be expected of a man chosen by Rudolph as groom for his daughter, Horchim crushed the weaker forces of insurrection as though they were eggshells beneath his heel. More than 500 million who had participated in the uprisings were killed, and of their families more than 10 billion had their citizenship revoked and were thrown into serfdom. In the suppression of opposing forces, be unsparing, said the imperial regulations, and they were followed to the letter. The forces of republicanism were once again made to endure a long winter. In the face of such powerful dictators, it was thought that this harsh winter would stretch on forever. After Horchim's death, Sigismund ruled directly, and after his death, Sigismund was succeeded by his eldest son Richard, who was in turn succeeded by his own eldest, Ottfried. The highest position of authority passed only to the descendants of Rudolph, and it looked as if heredity was the only thing that could determine the transition of power. However, deep beneath the thick ice, a watery convection current was silently moving. In Imperial Calendar 164, the Republicans of the Altair system, who had been denounced as a rebel clan, reduced to slave status, and set to hard labor, succeeded in escaping, using a spaceship that they had constructed themselves. Their plan was not like the ones that their forebears had been carefully refining for generations. The number of such plans that had been proposed was equal to the number that had ended in failure. The grave markers of Republicans had only increased, and in place of elegies, only the cruel laughter of the Bureau for the Maintenance of Public Order resounded among the graveyards. It was a cycle that had repeated itself endlessly. Yet finally, there was success, and from conception to execution, it had only taken 3 standard months. It had literally begun as child's play. A child of 2 slaves who were mining molybdenum and antimony in the cruel cold of Altair 7 had dodged out of the sight of his overseers and was playing at carving small boats from the ice, which he then floated out onto the water. A young man named Al-Heinesen had been watching him absently, and this image reverberated in the back of his mind like a divine revelation. Wasn't this lonely planet, after all, a bottomless storehouse of shipbuilding materials? On the 7th planet, the overall amount of water was not so great. It abounded more in natural dry ice than in frozen water. Heinesen shows a Heinesen shows a gargantuan mass of dry ice that was entirely buried in a certain valley. Its dimensions were 122 kilometers in length, 40 kilometers in width, and 30 kilometers in height. After hollowing out the center, he made a propulsion area and a living area, and soon it began to look like it could fly. The most difficult part of the plan was the question of how to get materials to actually build a spaceship. It was no good trying to obtain materials illegally, for if the Bureau for the Maintenance of Public Order got wind of it, they would simply arrest and slaughter everyone involved. However, this would also However, this world also had natural resources that would not draw the Bureau's attention. In the absolute zero cold of outer space, there was no fear of dry ice sublimating into gas. If they could just isolate the heat that would be generated by the propulsion and living areas, a considerably long-term flight would be possible. During that time, they could search asteroids and uninhabited planets for the materials needed to build an interstellar spaceship. There was no need to keep flying in the same ship in which they had departed. And so their glittering white spaceship of dry ice was christened the Ion Physigas, named after the boy who had made that toy boat out of ice. 400,000 men and women entered that vessel and escaped from the Altair system. This was the first step on a journey that historians would later dub the Long March of 10,000 light years. After shaking off the ruthless pursuit of the Galactic Empire's military, they hid themselves beneath the surface of a nameless planet and there constructed 80 interstellar spacecraft. Then they set out into the inner core of the galaxy. Here the escapees faced an immensity brimming with deadly giant stars, dwarfs, and variables. Here the ill will of the Creator crashed down on their heads time and time again. In the midst of this journey of hardship, they lost their leader Heinesen to an accident. His dear friend Kim Hwa Nguyen took over as leader. His dear friend Kim Hwa Nguyen took over as leader. By the time this man grew old and his eyesight faded, they at last passed out of the dangerous regions and found their future in a stable cluster of main sequence stars. More than half a century had passed since they had left Altair. To the stars of their new world they would give the names of the gods of ancient Phoenicia: Balat, Astarte, Melkart, Hadad, and others. They made their base on the fourth planet from Balat, to which they gave the name of their fallen leader, Heinesen, that his deeds might be forever honored. The conclusion of the long march of 10,000 light years occurred in Imperial Calendar 218, but these people, who had escaped the yoke of the dictatorship, chose to abolish the imperial calendar and revive the space-era calendar instead. In this, they prided themselves that it was they who were the rightful heirs of the Galactic Federation. Rudolph and his ilk were nothing more than contemptible traitors to democratic rule. In this manner, the establishment of the Free Planets Alliance was solemnly declared. It took place in Space Era 527. The first generation of its citizens numbered around 160,000. More than half of their comrades had perished during the long march. It was far too small a number to truly say that humanity had been divided. But the founders of the Free Planets Alliance possessed incomparable diligence and passion, and by their power, material fulfillment was rapidly attained. Childbearing was encouraged, and the population grew. A national establishment was put in order, and the agricultural and industrial production capacity steadily increased. It was as if the golden age of the Galactic Federation had returned. Then, in Space Era 640, the forces of the Galactic Empire and the Free Planets encountered one another for the first time in the form of a clash between battleships of both sides. From the standpoint of the Free Planets, such an encounter was a possibility for which they had long been preparing themselves. To the Imperial side, however, it came like a bolt from the blue, and so victory in the battle went to the Free Planets. However, just before a direct hit from a neutron beam cannon turned the Imperial warship into a fireball of destruction, an emergency communique leapt away toward the capital of the Empire. Imperial bureaucrats there extracted old records from computer archives and learned that more than a century before, there had been an incident involving slaves escaping from Altair. So they had not died out in space after all. They had lived and even prospered. A force was assembled to put down this insurrection. Great battleships were dispatched to the stronghold of those rebels, and there those warships were utterly defeated. There are many reasons why the Imperial military was so soundly beaten despite its superior numbers. For one thing, the long-distance campaign caused physical and mental exhaustion to set in on the Empire's soldiers and officers. For another, the issue of resupply was taken too lightly. In addition, the Imperial military knew too little about the area in which they were fighting. They also underestimated both the enemy's strength and will to fight. Their strategy was careless. The Free Planet's military had capable commanders, etc., etc. Pao Lin, commander-in-chief of the Alliance military, was a womanizer, a heavy drinker, and a glutton. And although the statesmen of the Alliance, who placed great importance on an ancient and puritanical simplicity of lifestyle, were apt to cast a cold eye on his behavior, the man was a genius when it came to tactics and strategy. Yusuf Toporo, his chief of staff, who assisted him in this work, was also known as Gripping Yusuf, for he was constantly crying foul in matters large and small, saying, "Why do you have to give me such a hard time?" Topperol, however, was also a precise and accurate theorist who might well have been called a living, breathing computer. Both men were still in their 30s when, on the outer fringes of the Dagon system, they conducted the greatest envelopment operation in history, annihilating the enemy and becoming the greatest heroes of the Alliance since its founding. For the free planets, this was an occasion for material expansion. When malcontent elements within the Galactic Empire learned of the existence of an independent power resisting the hegemony, they fled the Empire in droves. Seeking a home where they could live in peace, they came flooding into the Alliance. In the 3 centuries following Emperor Rudolph's death, the establishment, firm as it had once been, had become somewhat more lenient, and the influence of the Bureau for the Maintenance of Public Order, which had once spared no effort in oppressing the people, had faded as well. Voices of discontent within the empire were growing louder. The men and women who flowed into the Free Planets Alliance were accepted in a spirit of "He who comes shall not be turned away." But not all of these people held to Republican ideals. Among this number there were even some aristocrats and members of the imperial family who came, having been on the losing side of court intrigues. With such people being allowed entry, and with the free planets growing too quickly, it was an inevitable progression, perhaps, that the nature of the alliance should begin to change more and more. The Galactic Empire and the Free Planets Alliance had been in a chronic state of war since first contact. But from time to time, they were visited by periods of uncertain peace as well. A product of this was the Phazon Land Dominion. This was a sort of city-state in the Phazon star system, which lay almost exactly between the 2 powers. It was under the sovereign rule of the Galactic Emperor and paid tribute to the Empire. But when it came to its internal affairs, it was almost entirely self-governing. Above all, in that it was permitted to have diplomatic relations and trade with the Free Planets Alliance. The Galactic Empire, in making itself out to be the singular, absolute ruler of all humanity, did not acknowledge the existence of any legitimate authority outside the sphere of its influence. In official documents, the Free Planets Alliance was not referred to by its formal name. The rebel entity was written instead. The Alliance's military were rebels as well, and the chairman of the High Council, the Alliance's head of state, was that deplorable rebel warlord. With state regulations such as these in place, diplomacy and trade with the Alliance should have been out of the question. But Leopold Rapp, a powerful merchant of Terran birth, was possessed of a passion that might be called extraordinary, and drove forward the establishment of this most peculiar dominion. With petitions and persuasion, and above all, very large bribes, the matter was decided. Representing the Dominion was the Landesherr, or Dominion Lord, who as vassal of the Emperor ruled there in his name, oversaw commerce with the Alliance, and occasionally even played the role of diplomat. By monopolizing foreign trade, the Dominion accumulated massive stores of wealth, and small as it was, its power became impossible to ignore. It would be untrue to say that no one ever worked for amity between Empire and Alliance. Manfred II, who was enthroned in Imperial Calendar 398, or Space Era 707, was one of Emperor Helmut's numerous illegitimate children. After slipping through the clutches of assassins, he came to spend his early childhood in the Free Planets Alliance and grew up in a more liberal atmosphere. Because of this, it appeared that his enthronement might soon bring about peace and fair trade between the two powers, as well as political reform within the empire. However, these hopes soon came to nothing, as this young and popular emperor was assassinated within a year, and relations between the two powers immediately cooled. Manfred II's assassin was a reactionary aristocrat, but there is also a compelling argument suggesting that behind the scenes, the hands of Fezzan were at work, seeking to preserve its monopoly on the right to foreign commerce. And so, at the close of the 8th century space era and the 5th century imperial calendar, the Galactic Empire, undisciplined and uncontrolled simply because of its immense size, and the Free Planets Alliance, having lost the ideals of its founding period, continued on with their struggle mainly out of inertia, with Fezzan in their midst. According to the calculations of certain economists, the relative national power of the three states was as follows: Galactic Empire, 48%, Free Planets Alliance, 40%, Fezzan Dominion, 12%. The balance of power was precarious. Moreover, the total population of humanity, which had numbered 300 billion at the height of the Galactic Federation's prosperity, had by this time plummeted to 40 billion due to the long years of chaos. The distribution was 25 billion living in the Empire, 13 billion in the Free Planets Alliance, and 2 billion in Fezzan. It would be nice if something would work out, but it doesn't look like it will. That was a statement that described the situation nicely. What turned that situation on its head was the appearance of one young man on Odin, the third planet of the Valhalla system. Named after the chief deity of Norse mythology, Odin was the Hauptplanet to which Rudolf had relocated the capital of the Galactic Empire. The name of that young man of icy beauty and fearless countenance was Count Reinhard von Lohengram. Reinhard von Lohengram's last name was originally Musel. In an imperial calendar 467, or space era 776, he was born into an impoverished family that was aristocracy in name only. Aristocracy in name only. Reinhard's life changed when he was 10 years old, and Anna Rose, his elder sister by 5 years, was taken away to the inner palace of Emperor Frederick IV. Reinhard, a youth with golden hair and ice-blue eyes, became lieutenant commander of a division of Imperial Guards at age 15, receiving accelerated promotions thanks both to his own talent and to Anna Rose's favor with the Emperor. When he reached the age of 20, he received the title of Count von Lohengram and was promoted to the position of senior admiral in the Imperial Navy. This sort of extreme personnel management is typical of dictatorships, But with rank also comes responsibility. Had he been a noble of fine ancestry, there would be no great need to prove himself. But because Reinhard was nothing more than the little brother of the Emperor's favorite, he had no choice but to do so. At almost the same time, the Free Planets Alliance gained a new strategist. This was Yang Wen-li, who was born in Space Era 767 and enlisted at age 20. Yang Wen-li had never aimed for a career in the military, and if a series of coincidences hadn't pushed him in the right direction, he would have reached the end of his life not as a creator of history, but as a spectator. There are things you can do and things you can't do. That was Yang's pet philosophy. Toward fate, he had a much more passive disposition than Reinhard. But on the other hand, he had a great adaptability and inventiveness. Even so, he remained uncomfortable with war and the soldier's job of prosecuting it. And for the rest of his life, the military authorities were never free of his requests to chuck my rank and retire.